If we haven't met before, my name is Amanda Heggie. I'm the director of the Whitehall Public Library. And again, thank you for coming out tonight. I can only say that this is a testament to what a fantastic story this is. I have like 5 minutes left on the audiobook. I have a bone to pick with the guys married. But I'm sure you've heard that before. You didn't pick. I'm sure you didn't pick. No. Okay, so we're all here tonight to welcome John Armbruster. He's here from Westby. I'm sorry. I knew it was one of them. They're the same. No, I'm just he's here from Westby to share Gene Moran's story, and I think I'll just turn it over to him. So thank you again, Mel, for coming. I appreciate it.
I don't know if I've ever had the entire population of the town in one building before. And I've lived in Wisconsin my whole life. This is my first time in Whitehall. And I might need some of that beer and wine after a crowd like this when I'm done. I do have to ask a local note, though. So I'm a full-time teacher at Westby, and my colleague right next to me is a woman named Nancy King, who is Nancy Herman. And, okay. Nancy's like a sister to me, but we tease each other constantly. And Nancy grew up in Whitehall, graduated here. If you have any naughty stories about her, please share them with me, okay? So I can take them back to work. Okay. And, but yes, so she warned me about you guys. What a crowd. Okay, to be honest with you, and I was telling Amanda before, this is not the first time this has happened, where I've had an overwhelming crowd. This is about my 60th presentation. The book came out last April 30th. And I told Amanda, I said, I hate to say this. I don't want to sound like I'm bragging. Seriously, this is the power of this story and of this man, Gene Moran. Gene was born 1924 to 2014. We worked together for 3 years on this story, and he died in 2014, and then it took me another 8 years to finish. I first heard this story at my first full-time teaching job at North Crawford Schools down by Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. So here's Crawford County. We're in Trempealeau. Okay. I had to take some windy roads to get here from Sparta, Jackson, Trempealeau. I wasn't sure what the county line was. So yeah, not too far south of here is the first time I heard this story. And so I want to let you know my presentation's about an hour, so I know it's kind of full and stuffy in here, and I'll move quickly. I do have some video and some audio. I do want to let you know, I often have veterans at my presentations, that I do have a video with some combat noises in it, so I want to give you a heads up about that. And at the end, I will be selling books and signing books over that table. If you already have books, I will gladly sign those too. I will not be upset that you bought it from Amazon and not me, all right? I get more money when you buy it from me, but that's okay. I will sign them from Amazon. But yes, I was, October 1994, I heard this crazy story for the first time that I dared believe. I'm going to show you a video now in animation form of the story I first heard almost 30 years ago. October 1994, North Crawford School, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. It was an in-service day, no students at North Crawford schools. I was 2 months into my rookie year as a middle and high school social studies teacher. I love teaching history, but on that sunny late October day, I sat trapped in a molded plastic chair inside a windowless auditorium, daydreaming about escaping to a deer hunting stand. Our small K-12 public school sat next to the Kickapoo River, a crooked stream that twisted through a forested valley dotted with dairy farms just a few miles south of the town of Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. Ahead of me sat two men, visiting educators from another district. At break time, most of the teachers drifted out to the hall to head to the restroom or sip coffee. Not feeling like making small talk with strangers, I stayed in my seat and overheard the conversation in front of me. You know, this is the school with the art teacher whose dad was shot down without a parachute and lived, one of the men said to the other. I leaned forward. Yeah, Joni Peterson, the other replied. Her dad was a tail gunner during World War II. Shot down over Germany. I guess he fell some 4 miles or so before he hit the ground. Incredible. Doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Came down in a chunk of the plane, from what I know, and the Germans captured him. It took a moment for my dull brain to make sense of the words I just heard. Shot down without a parachute and lived? 4 miles? I could only catch snippets of the conversation as teachers shuffled back into the auditorium to take their seats. But I knew just where to go to get the story. Joni Peterson's art room sat right next to my classroom. Her art room functioned both as a student classroom and an unofficial teacher lounge. Conversation flowed easily there, but I was about to find out that one topic was taboo. I found Joni setting out construction paper and glue for the next school day, hurrying so she could get home. I burst into her room. Is it true, the story I heard about your dad? I asked. She paused, chuckled, and continued laying out construction paper. Yes, it's true, she said. Oh, lean Gene the fight machine. I quickly shared with Joni the conversation I'd overheard a few hours earlier. Okay, I heard his plane went down over Germany. You shot down, right? When? Where did he land? Tail gunner, right? What kind of plane? How badly was he hurt? Did the Germans capture him right away? How long was he a prisoner? Joni continued working, but offered few answers to my rapid-fire questions. So when can your dad visit my classroom, I asked. Joni dropped a ream of construction paper on the table. She glared at me. That's not happening. We don't go there. I should have known better. Many veterans don't share their war stories. On top of that, Joni had just lost her husband, a paralyzed Vietnam War veteran, to a heart attack a few months before I was hired at North Crawford. I muttered apologies and sank into silence. Joni shrugged. It's all right, she said. We just don't talk about it. So here I am, this geeked out history teacher, all excited to bring this man to my classroom, and I don't even get to know the story. I was quickly dismissed. Give me just a moment here to transition. A couple days later, Joni came back, and she dropped this newspaper article from the La Crosse Tribune on my desk, and she said, here you go. This is all I know about it. If you find out anything more, you'll know more than my brothers and sisters. And this was in 1992. There was an air show at the La Crosse airport, and Gene went up there. He didn't go up there to make a big deal. He just wanted to go see a version of his old plane, the B-17 Flying Fortress that was there. And a La Crosse Tribune reporter had caught wind of Gene being there and asked if he could take a picture and ask a few questions. Now, if you look closely at the picture, he ain't real happy about doing it. He's like, yeah, you get 3 questions. Took a picture, a couple statements, and Joni told me that's it. That is all we know, other than the basics. Now, Gene had been in the newspapers before. These are articles from 1944 when he was a prisoner of war. He didn't even know this was happening, but the story of his famous fall had leaked back to the United States. The paper on the left is from New York, the one in the middle, St. Paul, and the one on the right from Baltimore. These were mailed to his parents from all over the country. When Gene came home from the war in 1945, he did an interview with the Wisconsin State Journal, and that was it. He shut down for 65 years. I just ran into wherever I go in the state of Wisconsin, I get Gene Moran stories. Apparently, he was quite the party boy at the State Legion Convention every year. But one guy said, it's like we all knew the basic story, but he never talked about it, and he wouldn't talk about it. Until 2007, and I know a lot of you recognize this man from this area, Congressman Ron Kind, who just retired this past January. He used to do something called the Veterans Oral History Project. And one day, Gene's daughter called me up, saying, Joni, the same person I just read about, and she was all excited. oh my God, John, Dad's going to talk. I can't believe it. Dad's going to talk to Ron Kind. I'm like, whoa, 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 slow down. And by the way, I know I talk too fast, so I'll slow down. And she said, you're invited, La Crosse Airport. They're flying in a flying fortress from Oshkosh. Ron Kind set it up. So I went up there, and Ron did interview Gene, but that interview went about 15 minutes, and then Gene just shut it down. He said, we're done. And Ron Kind was nice enough to come to my book launch party in La Crosse last spring, and he said, yeah, I remember that one very well. That one didn't go very well. And but Gene did agree to fly in the airplane that they flew in for him. Now, these are my two sons. I lost my father early, and so did my wife, so they didn't have a grandfather. Gene was a surrogate grandfather to them, so they ran up and took a picture with Grandpa Gene before he hopped on the plane. And Gene took a 20-minute ride over the Mississippi River Valley. He got off the plane, and Channel 19 and Channel 8, La Crosse Tribune, and other newspapers were there, and they're shouting questions at him. And he just looked at him and said, I'm never doing this again. And I don't think he was just talking about a plane ride. But in the next 3-4 years, I really got on the family. I said, your dad has an amazing story. Someone's got to get this down, find an author, get a book, something before he takes us to the grave. And one of the daughters said to me, well, why don't you do it? And I laughed at such a preposterous notion. Now, I do have some writing experience. Before I became a teacher, I was a journalist for 2 years, and I actually worked at the La Crosse Tribune. And I'm being totally misleading here, showing off probably the one time I had my picture in the paper and one front page headline. I usually got the backstories, high school basketball roundups, car accidents, rookie stuff. And I did that for a couple of years. I enjoyed it, but I knew I wanted to be a teacher. So I only had a couple of years of writing experience, and it had been 20 years. And I said, absolutely not. I said, you guys need to find a real author. So I refused the project. So there's an irony here, you being here tonight. I wrote a book. I didn't want to. Later that summer, Joni came back up to me first day of school, and she said, Dad finally agreed to a book. He's going to do it. I'm like, oh my God, that's great. Who's your author? You are. I'm like, no, I told you no. And she said, and I'll never forget these words. They're in the book too. She said, John, if you don't do it, Dad's not going to do it. Gene and I had been friends for a number of years by this point. So I needed some help. Not only that, in the middle of this is my wife. My wife was fighting cancer at the time. Now, it was in remission, but I got 2 young kids. I'm a full-time teacher. I also coach. I'm like the last person in the world that should be writing a book. So I went to get some help. And I'm going to show you an author and his book, and I'm wondering if people from around here recognize who this guy is. You do? Thank you. Because I show off every chance I get that I knew this guy. I drop his name ceaselessly. So Ben Logan, if you don't know, wrote a bestseller in the 1970s called The Land Remembers, about a family growing up on a dairy farm in southwest Wisconsin in the 1920s in the Great Depression. It became a national bestseller. Gene spent most of his life away from Wisconsin. World War II took him away from Wisconsin. He's also a World War II vet. Spent most of his adult life in New York, but in the 60s bought the home farm back, which just happened to be in the North Crawford School District. So that's how I got to know him. He came to my classes to speak after a number of years. I told Ben, well, Sidney, you come to my classes. Let's just go to your place. I would get a bus and take my kids to see him every year at his house. We would sit in his house and ask questions. And how many of you knew this book or Ben Logan before? If you could get show of hands, I'm just kind of curious. We're not too far away, okay? Now, when I went to talk to Ben about doing Gene's book, he was in a nursing home at this point in Viroqua. And I knew Ben was also not only a writer, but a World War II combat veteran. He was in the Navy. His job in the Navy was, if you've ever seen the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, you know when those landing boats are going on to Omaha Beach and all hell is breaking loose? That's what he did. Not at Omaha Beach, but in Italy. He was in several invasions in Italy. And so he knew combat. He was the one to go to. And he said, John, you can do this. And he talked to me about interviewing veterans. He said, don't start talking about the war. Talk about farm life, milking cows by hand, and baseball. He loved baseball. Do that for a few months, then slowly get to the war story. Now, you hit a nerve, just stop, don't press it, back up, because I bet there's a good chance he comes back to it. Now, Ben knew what he was talking about. During World War II, There was one mission he got really sick and had to go to hospital ship. Sure enough, that is the mission that his boat and his 12 crewmates was destroyed and they all died. And I knew he felt some survivor guilt about that. And at that moment, I was about to leave, and he grabbed my arm and he said, this whole thing might blow up in your face. Thanks, Ben. So it took me another 4 months before I thought, I'm going to talk with Gene. Now, where can I talk with Gene? Where would he feel most comfortable? And I'm thinking Friday night fish fry, a bar, and a bottle of Blatz. That was his favorite beer. So we're going to meet at a well-known tavern in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin for fish and beer. And this scene right here develops that I'm about to read to you. And I got a switch here. I drove straight from work and parked in front of the tavern. I sat in my dark vehicle. The car thermometer registered a mere 10 degrees. The last shards of pink sky faded tonight. I hadn't eaten in hours, but I had no appetite. Of course, I'd shared meals with Gene before, but this time the stakes were so high. I stared at the red and white neon Budweiser sign in the tavern window and wrestled with my self-doubt. I'm not a writer. I spend 50-plus hours a week at my school. I have 2 growing sons. And the question that shadowed everything, as it had for 8 years, would my wife's cancer return? But if I didn't write Gene's story, who would? I headed into the tavern. The place was full. Men nursing cans of Bud Light and Coors Light sat on bar stools that ringed the oval bar. Joni had already staked out a table in the rear of the dining room. Gene wore his usual bib overalls and Army Air Corps baseball cap. He sat across the table from me next to Pauline, his wife now of 2 years. I have to pause at this point. You're like, wait, wife of 2 years? Gene's first wife had died about 10 years before this. Gene remarried at age 84. That tells you something about Gene Moran, okay? I met a couple of his girlfriends in high school, too, so yeah. Yes. The waitress jotted down our orders for beer and soda. Gene asked for a can of Blatz. The smell of fried cod and steaming baked potatoes arriving at our table helped settle my nerves a bit. It was time to talk book. I looked at Gene and swallowed. I was thinking about starting after Christmas on Thursday, after school for an hour or so. Will that work? Gene kept eating, not looking up. That would be fine, John, he replied, nodding his head, eyes riveted on his fish. I'd like to get in as many interviews as I can before spring, but as soon as school's out, we can pick back up with the interviews. Gene nodded, said nothing. I want to talk mostly about you growing up on the farm, and we can move to the war later. I hoped talk of his childhood instead of the war would put Gene at ease, but I could sense Joni was getting restless. Dad, she burst out. There's so much you haven't told anybody. She rushed on. You need to talk about your prisoner of war days and the ship ride. The ship ride when the Germans transferred you. We know nothing about that. Gene stopped eating and slowly set his fork down. He set both his arms on the table, looked up, and sat back in his chair. I didn't like what was happening. Joni's mention of the ship had stirred something in Gene. I closed my eyes and said to myself, Jesus Christ, Joni, shut up! You're moving too fast! But she pressed on, firing questions, rapidly talking, oblivious to her father's change in mood. Then Gene turned toward his daughter and roared, There are some things that are never going into any book! Everyone at the table froze. Nearby diners stopped talking. I didn't know what to say or do. I thought about Ben Logan's warning to me just 5 minutes into this project, and it was already blowing up in my face. Gene, I said at last, this is your story. We don't need to do this. Gene quietly picked up his can of Blatz and took a sip. He studied me for a moment, then his face softened. John, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. So we're going to do it. And I don't know a darn thing about writing a book. And this is where it starts. I say this every speech, the irony that one of the great World War II stories comes from such a humble home is never lost on me. Now, Gene did raise his kids in a larger home in downtown Soldiers Grove, but this is where he's very happy at the end of his life, a very simple man. The one thing missing, though, is the refrigerator when this picture was taken. His daughters hated the eyesore, but that was Gene's beer and bait fridge. His new wife would not allow worms in the house. He's a simple guy, and for 3 years we sat at his kitchen table and hammered out this story. In the interest of time, I got to start somewhere, so I'm going to start England, 1943. At this point, Europe is conquered by the Nazis, and the Americans are trying to destroy them from the air about a year before D-Day. And this bomber war, this air war to destroy their industry was not going well. American airmen were dying by the thousands, hundreds of planes were getting shot down. When Gene got there, they were required to do 25 combat missions before their tour of duty was done. In 1943, only 1 out of 3 airmen were finishing their tour of duty. When Gene first got there, that first night at the base, he was in a shower, and one guy that was lucky to leave said to him, for most of you, it's not if, it's when. Now, Gene, this is his plane, a Flying Fortress for any plane buffs out there. I remember his nephew did some research for me and found his plane. We were looking, I couldn't believe it. He goes, I think this is Uncle Gene's plane. He sent the picture to me. And I looked at it, I'm like, well, great, I can't show that in class. At least, depending on the age. Yes, they're crazy young men, and they put naked women on their planes. And the name of the plane was Rikki Tikki Tavi. Now, Rikki Tikki Tavi is a fictional character, a cartoon from a Rudyard Kipling novel. And I gave Gene the picture. I'm like, is this your plane? Because your nephew says it is. And he put up his magnifying glass. He's like, oh, yeah, that's the dolly. And I was about to ask, what does a snake-eating mongoose have to do with a naked woman riding a bomb? I'm like, I'm not even going to go there. So we're just going to move on. And this is Gene's crew. One of the quotes, whoops, let me back up. One of the things Gene said to me over and over is that they were closer than brothers. They came from all walks of life, city boys, country boys. I mean, this guy's from the Bronx, he's from Chicago. The 2 guys at the end are farmers, one from Oklahoma, one from Nebraska. The guy in the far end, Walter, is a chicken farmer. All the guys in the back are 19 or 2021. The pilot, down bottom right-hand corner, is 21 years old. The oldest is 27. The other guys are mid-20s. This guy was studying to become a minister. He was a college graduate. This guy barely got through high school, loved to party. He never drank. It was just but Gene said they were so close. He said, we partied together, we played softball together, we went to church together, we got in trouble together, and these were his guys. And on November 29th, 1943, in his 5th mission, they were bombing the city of Bremen, Germany. Bremen's about the size of Milwaukee, also an industrial town. They had dropped their bombs, but for some reason on the way back, their plane fell back from the rest of the squadron, which is a very bad thing. If you've ever seen nature videos where lions will separate a zebra from the herd, and then all the lions pounce on that zebra, that's what happened to Gene's plane. And in a terrific firefight, the plane got shredded. Gene was shot several times. Bullets went through his parachute. What you saw earlier in the video was Gene crawling forward to get a second parachute. The plane ripped right in front of him. He almost fell out. He whipped his body around and grabbed his rosary from his grandmother, and he said, I just relaxed. Why fight it? I'm going to die. It's about 4.5 miles up in the air, and he is falling very fast. He fell so fast, he said his teeth fillings popped out of his mouth. Blood rushed into his eyes. He was blinded for several days because the G-forces pushed blood into his eyes. And he fell 4.5 miles, hit a forest. I have been to the exact spot where Gene fell. The Germans know the story very well over there. And he was conscious all the way down. He said he crawled. He thought he had died, and he could see light, even though his eyes were blinded by blood, and he crawled out toward the light. You've heard that story before. But when he got out of the wreckage, he could feel leaves and twigs, and he said he started laughing. And I'm like, laughing? It's like I cheated death. I started laughing. I didn't feel anything. But then he rolled over, and he felt a strange sensation coming from his head. He had an 8-inch gash in his head, a major fracture, and he went up to feel it, and he could feel something gelatinous. It was his brain. And he knew he wasn't going anywhere. And at this point, I'm going to let Gene tell his story.
Were you still conscious?
Oh, yeah.
Were you stuck up there?
No. When it settled in, I caught it on the upswing.
Caught the tree. You caught the tree.
Yeah,
Okay.
they said lit in a tree. I didn't light in no tree. I lit against the tree.
You laid against the tree?
Against the tree on the upswing of the...
Okay. When you were twisting out, you were coming in.
Yeah, and this open part went down on the ground.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I crawled out the open part. Because then this open part dropped right down on the ground.
And then the open part kind of slid into the ground.
And I got turned around and crawled out. And by that time, the Frenchmen were there.
That fast?
Yeah. Oh, hell, they were watching the whole thing.
I'll interject for a moment. This confuses some people. You're like, wait, you said he was shot down over Germany. He was. It was nearby a prisoner of war camp. These were French POWs that the Germans would let out to scrounge for food. And they learned to find crash bombers because the American flyers carried Hershey bars with them, and they would steal those Hershey bars from dead men. They thought Gene was dead, so they went up to get his goodies.
And how quickly between the time you crawled out and the Frenchmen were there?
Well, it could have been over 5 minutes.
5 minutes, they'd been watching.
They'd been watching. They were just jabbering and going on, pointing at the sky, pointing at me, and pointing at the tail of the plane.
Well,
I never knew why we slid back that day. I'll never know to the door. I will never know.
slid back.
We were right up in formation.
Mm-hmm.
Just, of course, they were just shooting at us something terrible everywhere, but we're still up.
Oh, wait, the day you slid back, the day you got shot down?
Yeah. And we slid back, kept sliding back. And I even called and I said, what's the matter? We're not staying up in formation. We're being pushed out. Well, I don't know what he meant by being pushed out or what. Whoever answered me, I can't remember. But boy, when we got pushed out.
Is that when the fighters all started hopping on you then? Yeah. When you guys started falling back, how many fighters were starting to hit you guys?
Well, I was shooting. Both waist gunners were shooting. The ball turret gunner was shooting. The top turret gun guy was shooting. And I believe the bombardier. No, he had that little gun poked out the one side. He was shooting too.
Yep. After Pee Wee hit and Orson's pushing the bombardier out, is the plane sustaining any damage at this point?
Oh, it's just getting rid of it.
Just.
It wasn't the one that came up underneath. It was one that drifted in that came in. Oh, I could even see his scarf with his goggles.
You said you could see a scarf in his goggles.
Yeah, and he pointed down.
And yes, this is what you see. A German fighter plane pulled right up next to him. And when I remember Gene telling me the story, my mouth is open. I'm like, what? And I said, how close was he to you? He said, from me to the TV away. We're in his living room at this point. So that plane pulled up really, really close to him to give him a chance to get out.
And you didn't know why he pointed down?
No, I figured he meant bail out.
Bail out. Okay.
That's what I figured he meant, but somebody cut loose up in front. Trapped, but you gotta remember, I got a bone sticking out of this arm.
Oh, I didn't know. When did that happen?
Oh, that happened through the mission. See, it started here and come up here, and I got bones sticking up through.
When did that happen in the mission?
On that mission.
But I mean, at what point?
Well, I don't know. I was too busy.
Which
This one here was, oh hell, it was all bleeding out through the suit.
When did you get hit? I didn't know you'd been hit before that.
Oh God, I was hit 3 or 4 times, had all these ribs broke. And then I started to crawl up to get, I had a chest suit laying right in front of the tail wheel. Yet I crawled up to get that, and all at once it just started down, and you can't move. And all at once it broke in two, and I'm looking right out into space.
Yeah, his mom was not going to let him go to war. She said, you can get a farmer deferment. Her quote was, you can serve your country by milking cows as much as you can by shooting at the enemies. Gene thought he could forge his way into the Army Air Corps.
He said, young man, he said, you come back with any more of these forged papers, and he said, you won't need to have to worry about going into service. He said, I admire you for wanting to get into service this bad. But he said, you forge any more papers. And he said, I'll have you put where you won't need to worry about the service. So home, and I went home, and I said, well, I'm in the service now. How could you? We didn't sign for you. Well, I said, I forged your names. Well, we can get that broke. No, I said, you can't. I'm already sworn in, and I wasn't. But I said, you'd make it a lot easier for me if you would sign these papers in case they ever come back and check on it. Well, if you're that determined to go and get yourself killed, we'll sign it.
She had no idea what she was saying.
It's the most beautiful thing to go up above, get above them clouds and see the sun.
Oh, wow.
It looks just like a city. That is the most beautiful thing that I have ever seen in my life.
How did you check if oxygen worked? How did you check that?
You know, if you had a little hangover, you just hooked it, and you stuck that in your mouth, and then you turned the valve. And if your head cleared right up, and the oxygen was working.
Oh my God.
The oxygen was working.
It works.
Otherwise, we called everybody by our first name.
You did? Officers too?
Oh, yeah. There was no, we were a family, a tight family.
And that's what made you guys such good friends.
If they didn't live, you didn't live.
Okay.
And at this point, it's always hard to know where to stop with Gene quotes because there are many of them. He's a colorful guy. But on one of our interviews, I told Gene, I said, you know, it's time for a field trip. I want you to take me to the farm that raised you. The barn where he started milking cows, hand milking cows at age 6 is still there. That's the red barn there. That's Gene posing with a picture with my wife. And he took us to the house where he was raised is still there. It's now rented out. But he gave me a tour of his home farm. And then we took a bunch of pictures, Gene with my wife, Gene with some kids. And a little while after this, my wife said, something's not right. I got to go home. And he said, you look fine. But then I noticed her left cheek was throbbing violently. And took her to the hospital, and she was having a seizure. I called her oncologist or cancer doctors up at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, and they said, get her here immediately. So I took her up there, and we have this procedure where we have a brain scan in the morning, a nervous lunch, and then we see the doctors in the afternoon, and usually they're clear. Sometimes a stubborn tumor would show up in the back of her brain, but they'd always manage to get it with surgery. On that day, after this picture, the neurosurgeon put up the brain scan on a screen much like this, and the brain scan lit up like a Christmas tree. There were tumors everywhere in her brain and lines of cancer. And I looked at the neurosurgeon and said, we really don't need you anymore, do we? He said, no, you don't. So my wife died 6 months later. And at this point, the book project is done. I'm a single dad with 2 middle school boys, and the book's not going to happen. Later that year, I did go to Madison at a Writers Institute, and I never felt more out of place in my life. These were all writers. They had books, working on second books. I had 1 chapter written, and it wasn't that great. But here's where I met my editor, and she had written 4 books herself. She's currently working on her 5th book. And she asked, what is your plan with this book? Who are you? And what's this amazing story? I said, well, we're gonna I'm going to write it. The family's going to do a self-publishing thing, and we're just going to keep it in Southwest Wisconsin, not really make a big deal out of it. She said, this is an amazing story. You need to get back at this and make a real book out of it. You need to get an agent. You need to get a publisher. You need to do a book proposal. I will be your editor. She said, but good books take time. She said, this is going to take you 5 to 10 years. Now, Gene's 88 at this point. Does he have 5 to 10 years? And coincidentally, that very weekend when I'm in Madison, Gene had a heart attack. And he was nearby Madison, so they rushed him to the VA hospital in Madison. The family called me, and I'm calling them back. I want to see him. I want to go visit him. I'm like, can I see him? They're like, I don't know what condition he's in. It's like, I got to see him before he dies. My God. And so they let me, and I go up to the hospital room, and I'm rushing up there, and I think I'm going to walk into a room with heart monitors beeping and tubes coming out of his nose, and I walk in, and I find this scene. I ain't kidding. I walked in, he's like, hey, John, get a load of this. So yes, that is Miss Wisconsin and Miss Teen Wisconsin from that year that came up to visit the war hero, and fine young ladies, but had to ask them to leave as Gene and I had some book talk to do. So I'm trying to gather my thoughts, he's alive, and then I told him, I got some news for you, someone wants to make a real book out of this. But she said it'll take 5 to 10 years. He knew what I was getting at. The man just had a heart attack. And he said, he didn't wait long. He said, John, if I don't read it down here, I'll read it up there. So we started. And I bet many of you are familiar with this book, another World War II survival story, crazy survival story, terrible POW experience like Gene. And I wanted to write in a style like that, a narrative, almost like fiction. But my editor said, well, she listened to some of the same quotes that you did. She's like, this is one heck of a character. He's a crazy guy. I want to know him as an old man. I'm like, I can do that. We can put both stories together and weave it, but it's getting more complicated. So we're putting the story together, and she said, wait a minute, in the middle of this, your wife died. I said, yes. Well, as a reader, if you're going to have Gene as an old man and you at that mobile home table, we have to know this as a reader. I'm like, no, you don't. I said, I lived it. I'm not writing about it. She kept twisting my arm. And she said, I think we could do something like Steel Magnolias into this book too. I'm like, okay, let me get this straight. I've never written one book. Now you have me writing 3. But I think we have something kind of unique. And it's hard to categorize this book. And all the people here tonight, testament to this story. Is it a World War II story? Is it a history book? Is it an old man coming to terms with his life? Is it about a young man trying to get a book out while his wife's dying? I don't know. Yes, all of them. But I'm going to end tonight with a quick video on my publisher made a video based on this review to promote the book that I will end with tonight. And that's Tailspin. So.